the cool things about this is I can cook on the top of this. Not a whole lot. It's, you know, it's not like the greatest thing, but as long as you stay off the catalytic converter, which is right in the middle, you can heat things up on this stove. And so we had a deer. We took we took several deer this year. So we got some deer fat going, and it's obviously not, we're in a basement, so you're not getting as much light as you normally would, but so we got some deer fat off of this. Here's the thing about if you want a deer with lots of fat, you want either a young deer or a doe. The big, massive antler bucks, trophy bucks, just don't produce a lot of fat. And the reason for that is because these guys, during the fall and early winter, they have one thing on their mind, and that is the rut. That's when they go and breed. Deer only get to have sex once a year, the male deer do. So they stop eating. They stop doing everything. And they lose fat. In fact, sometimes male deer will be so into the rut that they starve to death during the cold winter months if you have a hard winter. So if you want a lot of fat on one of your animals, you want a smaller animal, a younger animal, or a doe. In fact, does always have more fat on them. This came from a young buck. He was just a button buck. And because he was young, nature takes care of the children, the next generation, more than it takes care of the adults. So this young button buck had plenty of fat. So what we did is we just basically threw the fat into a pot. Allie's downstairs with me. We threw the fat into a pot, and then we put just enough water in it so that the fat wouldn't burn, maybe an inch or two on the bottom, probably closer to 2 inches on the bottom. And then this is what's called rendering the fat, and what you're doing is you're getting all the fat out of these chunks. Now, a lot of people will grind this up, and if you're going to cook on something like a gas stove, I'm going to back up just a little bit because it's a bit warm. If you're going to cook something like this on a gas stove, or on an electric stove or something that you're paying for that heat, probably grinding it up is not a bad idea because it renders a lot faster. The smaller the pieces, obviously, the faster the stuff renders out. But for me, since I'm just doing it on top of this thing's going to be going anyway, the stove is going to be going anyway because I really like to be warm inside my house, then for me, getting the grinder out, setting it up, grinding the fat, and then cleaning that grinder back up again, the cleanup is the worst part, is not worth the effort. I've got, because it's not going to save me anything, because it's not like I'm using any store-bought gas or anything. But if you're going to be cooking it, which most people will be on a stove, grinding it up or even chopping it into very small pieces is the best way to go about it. And basically, it's going to take a couple hours sitting here, and we'll come down. I've got a masher over here, and we'll come down every now and then and just kind of mash the fat out of the chunks. And eventually, what we're going to get is we're going to get the cracklings, which is the membranes on the fat. The fat has, I can't really pick it up with my fingers because it's a bit warm, but the fat has membranes on it, and those will kind of just render down. And they also got some meat and stuff that, even though we tried to get as much meat off the fat as possible, you're not going to get 100% of it off. So there's like little bits of meat and then cracklings in there, and those will be used, well, we feed them to the pigs. But they can also be used for dog food. You can feed them, to pretty much any. The chickens love them. Because it's venison, so as long as you're not feeding it back to the venison, to a deer, you're doing fine. And so don't throw that stuff out. It'll kind of look like really well-cooked hamburger. And, that, like I said, you just give that as pet food somewhere, or to the chickens, or to the pigs, or whatever. And then the rest we will pour through a sieve so that we can separate it out. And the water will, the part it'll cool, and the fat will harden, and the water will go down, the fat will float to the top and harden, and then you'll have your tallow. It's called tallow at that point. And what we're going to do is I'm going to make some soap. That's what we've been doing for the last few weeks, is every spare moment we're making soap. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make some deer tallow soap, and we're just going to make this into plain white soap. We may mill it later and put stuff in it, but right now we're just going to make a plain white soap. I'm melting down my fat here, and we're going to do that for a little while, and in a couple hours it should be ready and set, and then I will go from there. Okay, so once you get it where you've pretty much rendered all the fat out, and you can see here, you can see there's a little bit of these light colored things, so that means the fat is not 100% rendered out. You like that brown color to it, but you'll see here there's a little of the white things in. At the last minute we had not at the last minute, but about an hour before, we had some scrap pieces that we just threw in there just to take out whatever we could out of them. But I mean, I could keep rendering this to get that down. That's not a problem, but I'm not going to. We're about done. And if you have a mesh that's that's narrow, you can kind of squeeze a little bit of this out, but don't do a whole lot of squeezing with this. Let it drip itself, and that way you don't get as many in the product below. You're not going to get as many impurities. You may get one or two, but you're not going to get many. And since we're using this for soap, of course, the last thing we want is impurities in there. And we're just going to let this drip. This stuff here for me will go into split between the pigs and the chickens. Anyway, I've got this outside. It's on the chest freezer outside, and that's because it's about 35 degrees here. It's going to get just a little bit below freezing here tonight, and so it's going to set up my tallow a little bit faster. You don't want it to freeze like all the way, because there is a little bit of water in this, and the water is going to go to the bottom, and of course the fat, as normal, floats on top. Then the fat will harden up. This fat becomes solid at room temperature, so but you don't want that water to freeze, because else you got to warm it up enough to get that water off of it. So I just put it out here because it's going to help me make this go a little faster, but that's not you know, I don't want to sit it out here overnight. I'm going to come back in an hour and a half, and this should have cooled down enough that we have the tallow itself is hard, but the water is still liquid, and that's what I'm looking for. Anyway, and then at that point this thing will be done dripping, or it will have solidified as well, and then we'll take that out. Like I said, that's for here. It's going to go out to our pigs and our chickens. We're going to kind of give like a third of it to the chickens, and then the 2/3 of it to the pigs. A little extra protein in their diet, a little extra fat source, especially this time of the year where it's going to be a little bit more chilly. And I'll show you this stuff. Well, here we can at least look down into, if I can do this without dropping the whole thing down in there, you can see there's the fat down in the bottom. And we'll come down and look at it after it's solidified. Right now it looks just like kind of yucky fat, but it should turn into a white colored fat, nice solid tallow that we will be using for making soap, and I'll show you that when we get to that. Okay, so here's our tallow, and we've rendered it. We've done a lot of cleaning out of it. We've gotten all the stuff, cracklings and everything out of it. We put it into a container and it hardened. Then I cut that into fourths, so you can see we get these little wedges. Now here's the thing, on the bottom you can kind of see there's like a layer of not the most pleasant stuff in the world. It's a little darker. We like that nice white tallow, so I am going to cut this small layer off. I'm just going to put it in here, and I feed it to the wild birds. You can feed it to your chickens, you can feed it to the pigs, you can feed it, but if you don't have chickens or pigs, which a lot of people don't, the wild birds like this a whole lot. Just, you know, kind of put it, if you got a mesh bag, you can kind of cut that layer off and put it in a mesh bag, but even if you just put it onto a board or something, or smear it into the bark of a tree, the birds will come in and eat that. And it will, because you've rendered it, it's going to be harder, so it's not going to melt as much. And then we're going to get busy making soap this afternoon. I got a couple friends coming over, but I think we're going to make a batch of ourselves, because this is enough here for at least 3 batches, if not 4 batches of soap. And so we're going to use that. We're going to get going with that this afternoon. I think one of those batches I'm going to make on my own and videotape it. So then I'll see if I can get that out to you. But anyway, that is rendering tallow, and tallow can be used for anything. You can see here we're at room temperature and it's hard, so it can be used for salves. In fact, most of our salves of old used to be made with animal fat. I don't know if you ever heard of goose grease or bear grease, things like that. This was actually, it wasn't grease, it was rendered tallow that they made their salve out of. And then, you know, that was goose grease. What goose grease was most known for was that you blended certain herbs with it to loosen. You rubbed it on your chest to loosen up chest congestion. And again, this is the salve that they used, because it wasn't like they had a whole mess of olive oil and beeswax and everything. That olive oil is is specific to a certain area, a certain climate that a lot of people don't have, so they used this as their salve. It also is great for candles, tallow candles. They don't burn bright like petroleum wax does. Most of your candles that you have nowadays are made out of oil, petroleum wax. But these do still burn, and in fact I may end up making a couple tallow candles because I think we're going to have enough left over. And so, you know, they're good for that. Anything, if you need fire starters, great fire starter is to take your dryer lint, stuff it down into a toilet paper roll thing, you know, and then pour tallow over it. And you gotta, the tallow makes it burn longer, and the toilet paper and the dryer lint, you know, is your wick, burns up real fast. Or not burns up real fast, but lights really fast, and then the tallow makes it burn long enough to light your wood. So it makes a great fire starter as well. And then, of course, as we're using it, we're going to use it for soap. And I mean, the list of fat is one of your hardest things to get in the real world, not in the modern day world where we get way too much fat, but in the real world, fat is a boom and bust thing. When you kill an animal, you get a lot of fat. And people who live, for those of us who milk our cows, dairy is a steady source of fat. That's one of our few steady sources of fat that most people can get a hold of, is a dairy of some sort. But you know, when you slaughter the fatted calf, that's when you get your fat. And after that's used up, you either have to slaughter another animal or you don't have fat for a little while, which is usually what happens. It's boom or bust. And it's not like you can store this stuff forever. If we didn't make soap within a month or two, once it's rendered, it is going to last longer. But within a few months, if it's not kept in a cool place, it is going to go rancid. If you can keep it in a cool, dry place, you may be able to get it out for the winter. That's how, that was the other thing that people used fat for, tallow. And I had that when I was a child. People used fat for this, but you would take all your meat and stick it down into a barrel of some sort that didn't breathe, like a crock, like the old-fashioned big crocks, and you put your meat into that, and then you would melt a layer of tallow over the top, so the tallow would, you know, so you get a nice thick layer like this, and it would keep the air out from the meat and keep the meat preserved in a cool place. That was back before we had refrigerators. Anyway, so I want to get going with this, get this cleaned up, and just get that layer cleaned up. If you get these little spots, I don't worry too much about, but if you get like a big spot of the brown in there, then that you can cut out too. You don't usually get too many of them, and just a few little ones doesn't bother me at all, but the big one on the bottom I am going to clean out. So get to that, and then we'll go make soap probably this afternoon.